Hello, welcome to the debate. The West should not use military force to prevent mass atrocities. It's organised by the Imperial War Institute and the peace-building NGO Conciliation Resources, and it's part of an online series, Reimagining Victory, marking the 75th anniversary of VE Day this year. My name is Lindsey Hilsum. I am the international editor of Channel 4 News, and I am joined by two seasoned debaters with very different views on this subject. First of all, we have Sanam Naraghi Anderlini. She is the founder and CEO of International Civil Society Action Network, ICANN. That's an organization whose mission is to support civil society activism. She is also the director of the London School of Economics Centre for Women, Peace and Security, and her most recent book is called Women Building Peace, What They Do and Why It Matters. And I'm also joined by David Aaronovitch. He is a regular columnist for the Times, sometimes I would say a controversial columnist for the Times, and his most recent book is Party Animals, My Family and Other Communists. So this subject is, we have been talking about it for many years now, but at no point is it more important as right now, because we've seen Western intervention with disastrous results in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya. It shouldn't have happened. It was something that caused death and mayhem. On the other hand, we have seen a lack of Western intervention in Syria. Death, mayhem, the same thing. And many people are saying that that was a war which was made so much worse because there wasn't Western intervention. And so that is the context in which we discuss this very important issue. Is it damned if you do and damned if you don't? Is it a bad choice of when to intervene? Some have succeeded. Sierra Leone is often cited. Or is this just a colonial hangover, the white man and woman's burden, which is no longer relevant in the modern world? Those are some of the issues we're going to be discussing. So both of the panelists are going to start with a statement, 5 or 6 minutes each, and then I'm going to chair a debate between the two. So let us start first with you, Sanam Naraghi Anderlini, arguing for the case the West should not use military force to prevent mass atrocities. Over to you, Sanam.
Thank you, Lindsey. Thank you to the Imperial War Museum and Conciliation Resources. So let's look at the evidence of the past 20 years. Lindsey, you just mentioned it. After 9/11, searching for bin Laden, and because Laura Bush told us that we cared about Taliban atrocities against women, the West military went into Afghanistan. By last year, conservative UN estimates suggested that some 100,000 Afghans had been killed. We've reinvigorated the Taliban. We've inspired the Khorasan brand of ISIS. We didn't heed the warnings of Afghan women about actually what we should do and how to do it better. And now we're leaving them out of the negotiations and at risk of more atrocities. 2003, fear of weapons of mass destructions, or was it concern for the Kurds or the Shias or the women? Whatever the excuse, we went into Iraq. In just 3 years, the Lancet reported we caused 600,000 deaths. And the Iraq debacle gave us ISIS and their mass atrocities. Could we have done better? Yes. Before the war, the Pentagon had drawn up a detailed 160-point plan for securing the peace for the day after the toppling of Saddam. Those plans were ignored. In the aftermath, there were lessons. Did the West learn them? Well, fast forward to Libya to 2012, Mr. Sarkozy led the UN, NATO went in to protect Libyans from atrocities. But instead of heeding the advice and the warnings of Libyan activists, Libyan women who were at the forefront of the revolution, what we did was we basically outsourced the security vacuum to the Emiratis and the Qataris, and they brought in their Salafi and other militias. And Libya, which is an incredibly rich country with a very little population, has become known for its slave markets. Syria. Oh, if only we'd invoked force in Syria, Assad's atrocities would have stopped. But we did invoke force. We, the West, armed militias and fueled the war. My Syrian colleagues have been saying to me for years, the world is helping us kill each other no one is really helping us talk to each other. And when Mrs. Clinton said Assad must go, she basically closed the door to any form of structured, effective negotiations. And then Yemen. Why support the Saudis' deadly tantrum in Yemen? Because, according to US officials, we'd help the Saudis avoid civilian casualties. By last year, we had killed 100,000 Yemenis, and it's still going on. So the fact is, we've invoked military force in the name of preventing mass atrocities, and we've enabled mass atrocities. We don't actually care about human life. We enter these places not because we care about the atrocities we care, it's because of the oil or because of the weapon sales and so forth that is beneficial to us. Sometimes we claim that, you know, we meant well, but we repeated the same mistakes. So either we're useless at it, or this mayhem of sort of righteous interventionism is benefiting somebody, and we need to think about that. And then finally, our involvement abroad and the violence we fueled is fueling insecurity and radicalization at home. So we have to think about the implications back in our own streets in London and elsewhere. Where does this leave us? This framing of the choice between doing nothing or unleashing military force is false. And as a peace advocate, I would not like to sit on the sidelines and ignore the warnings, as we did in Rwanda, as we've done with the Rohingya, as we're doing with the Uyghurs. I think that there's plenty to do. And I'll leave you with 3 thoughts on that one. One, diplomacy. We've forgotten the art of diplomacy. The US and the USSR had very structured engagement throughout the Cold War. There were all sorts of ways of mitigating violence and so forth. By contrast, if you look at US-Iran relationships, which is highly contentious and dangerous, for up to in the first sort of 30, 40 years of this, there was less FaceTime diplomacy between the Iranians and the Americans than there would be in an amicable divorce prior to the JCPOA. So we don't really talk to each other. Secondly, we're not very strategic or visionary when it comes to thinking about diplomacy. When the Syria conflict was bubbling up in the context of the UN, there were various things that we could have done to make it a regional dialogue, bring the Iranians in, and etc., and think about a solution to the problem. Instead, the choice was, let's just freeze the violence and unfreeze the politics, as if some hashtagable response would be the way to go forward, and it was a missed opportunity. Third, inclusive peace talks. We know that when you have an inclusive process, as the Yemen National Dialogue was, as the Colombia processes have been, things stop and it makes a difference, and yet we don't do it. If diplomacy isn't enough, targeted network-oriented sanctions. By that, it means the people that are benefiting from the war, their families, their shell companies, the London houses that they end up buying with the profits of war, those things can be targeted so that war is not profitable. We're not doing enough of that. Peacekeeping is a third idea. Blue helmets make a difference. If Kofi Annan, who was the head of peacekeeping operations at the UN, when General Dallaire called him about the Rwanda genocide, if he'd heeded General Dallaire's advice, it's possible that the Rwandan genocide would not have happened. And yet, you know, we think that military force is better than peacekeeping. So in conclusion, the collateral damage from the West's love affair with military intervention is profound. In 2003, we, without the Security Council's approval, launched the Iraq War. By trampling over international laws and norms, we signaled to others that they could too. Our use of force has led others to be preemptive. Myanmar hides behind China while terrorizing the Rohingya, knowing we won't pick a fight with its big backer. The good news is that we do have the tool to improve things. And the end of the war, in fact, this moment is really important because the idea was never again mass atrocities, but also never again war. But we need to use those tools. We need to reform them. We need to also acknowledge the harm we've done in the last 20 years. If we value human life, we have to put human rights front and center of our foreign policy. So I stand by the motion the West should not use military intervention to prevent mass atrocities. Military force to prevent mass atrocities is a contradiction in terms. Thank you.
Sanam, thank you very much indeed. And I picked out one very key sentence in that fascinating presentation, which was, in the name of ending mass atrocities, we have enabled mass atrocities, which seems to me that that is the key thing that you're saying, and you gave us a lot of food for thought. David Aaronovitch, let me hand over to you now to counter what Sanam has just said.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'm delighted to take part and pay tribute to a very coherent proposition of the motion. I just want to take us back in the first instance to July 1995 and the town of Srebrenica in Bosnia, what is now Bosnia. That was designated by the United Nations after several years of ethnic cleansing in the area, mostly conducted by Serb forces, as a safe area. The United Nations decided that this would be a safe area for the civilians of that particular town and the area around it. Defending the civilians in that area, by the time we got to July 1995, was a small number of underarmed Dutch peacekeepers. In the middle of July 1995, Serb forces overran Srebrenica. The Dutch forces were unable to stop them. What resulted from that was the death of 8,000 Muslim men and boys who were massacred in what was the largest European massacre since the end of the Second World War. 10 years later, Kofi Annan sent Mark Malloch Brown to address the anniversary at Srebrenica. And this is part of the address that Kofi Annan wrote. For us who serve the United Nations, that truth is a hard one to face. We can say, and it is true, that great nations failed to respond adequately. We can say, and it is also true, that there should have been stronger military forces in place and a stronger will to use them. As I wrote in my report in 1999, we made serious errors of judgment rooted in a philosophy of impartiality and non-violence, which, however admirable, was unsuited to the conflict in Bosnia. That's why, as I also wrote, the tragedy of Srebrenica will haunt our history forever. It certainly had a significant effect on quite a few of us in the West. This came 1 year after the event that you were talking about, Sanam, which was the Rwandan massacre of 1994, in which 800,000 people were killed in 100 days. I remember Fergal Keane reporting for the BBC, a Panorama programme, a couple of weeks, maybe 3 or 4 weeks into that massacre, looking at it and thinking to myself, how is it possible that with all the resources that the world's armies and navies and militaries have, that we cannot in some way stop this from happening? And it reminded me of the feelings that you often had after looking at what had happened to the Jews and others of Europe during the Second World War, the kind of extraordinary problem of being unable to save large groups of people from massacre. It's not surprising then that when we got to Kosovo in the spring of 1999, you've said that the West is never interested in saving lives, but actually the West has been sometimes interested in saving lives, and Kosovo was a prime example of that. The UN had created resolutions about Serb behavior, not surprisingly, given what had happened in Bosnia, but it would not actually allow people to, the Security Council would not actually accept a resolution to take action in the context of Kosovo. So NATO effectively did it, started the bombing of Serbia to prevent what it regarded as an incipient genocide. There was no significant Western interest in the area. There was no natural resource and so on. This was largely because of the belief that not only was Kosovo a disaster happening in front of everybody, but that also it would set an example in the rest of that part of Europe, which would be genuinely catastrophic. There was talk about what would happen in Macedonia. The argument about how successful or otherwise the Kosovan exercise was goes on, but from my point of view, I say it was pretty successful. Now, what a lot of this led to was a decision enabled by Kofi Annan that we should look at the question of the responsibility to protect. The concept of responsibility, it drew inspiration from the idea of state sovereignty as a responsibility, but it affirms the notion that there are moments when you should actually if a state is in derogation of its ability either to protect its citizens or actually is acting inimically, then that you should step in. Now, in the first instance, we should say that I would not be in favor of the West doing this if the world did this. And I would not be in favor of it being military action if the action the world could take would actually prevent these things without any such recourse to military measures. There are a few, I suppose, terrible old warriors who believe that war solves all problems. And I certainly don't find myself amongst them. But the problem is that there are vicious armed dictatorships who impose upon their peoples and other peoples such levels of violence, not as a long recourse, but as an initial recourse to dissent or to solving problems in their own areas, that actually they are not susceptible to some of the measures that you have been talking about, certainly not in the first instance. Now, these interventions can be more or they can be less. There was the question of safe havens for Kurds in the wake of the first Gulf War, and it would be interesting to know what your view is of the Western policing of no-fly zones over the area of Kurdistan in the wake of that, in order to make sure that civilians were protected. That was a form of military action largely undertaken by the West for straightforwardly intervention reasons, and it would be enjoyable to understand what your view of that would be. Since then, and what has been conceived of, I mean, it has to be said firstly that Iraq in 2003 nor Afghanistan in 2001 were actually undertaken for humanitarian reasons. In the case of Iraq, as we know, the reason was for non-compliance with weapons inspectors, and in the case of Afghanistan was actually because of the direct attack on the United States emerging from Afghan territory. The problems that both those situations gave rise to was the question of what we call adequate state building, something which we've never really solved, and which in the case of Libya, nobody really tried to solve. And I completely agree with your view about outsourcing these kinds of things to various regional actors. And nor would I consider under any circumstances support for the Saudi interventions in Yemen as being part of a Western attempt to save civilians and so on. I think it's fair to say that everybody has failed in that course. But,
David, I'm going to ask you to wrap up your argument, if you could.
Absolutely, I knew I would rattle on far longer than I should do. That's not to say that there aren't significant problems here. There are huge problems here, not least, of course, that there is no willingness currently in the West or anywhere else to undertake military interventions or practically any other large-scale interventions to save large-scale civilian lives. So in a way, this might have been a live debate in before 2013, but at the moment, the debate is whether there's willingness to undertake any kind of significant intervention in order to save civilian lives anywhere in the world by anybody. But the final problem I want you to address, Sanam, if you would, is it's one thing to castigate the West. The countries which have most significantly prevented the United Nations Security Council from taking any significant action of the sort I might like or you might like have actually been countries like Russia and China. And it would be interesting to know what it is that you think should and could be done to persuade them to take a view that actually they do have a responsibility.
Thank you very much, David. And Sanam, I'm going to put a couple of David's points to you in a minute. But first of all, I should say, listening to this, I realize that I'm a kind of interested party, because I was in Rwanda when the genocide broke out. I was in Libya when Colonel Gaddafi, I was in Benghazi when Colonel Gaddafi threatened to go zenga, to go alleyway by alleyway, rooting out and killing his opponents, which was the reason for that intervention. And I was in Iraq in 2003, and I spent a lot of time in Syria and so on. So Sam, I wanted to put that to you. Speaking as someone, let's take the Libya example. We all know what's gone wrong in Libya. However, if you were there, as I was, in Benghazi at the time, you did think that you were going to end up like the men and boys of Srebrenica, who David has just talked about. We had no reason to doubt that Colonel Gaddafi meant what he said, and he was going to go house to house, slaughtering everyone. So should that have just been allowed to happen? Sorry about that, people of Benghazi. You're all going to die.
Thank you. No, that's thank you very much. And I was at the UN the night that the Security Council adopted the resolution to enable NATO to go in, and it was a very tense evening because there was a sense of what are we getting ourselves into? This is invoking responsibility to protect, and what's going to happen. And to be honest with you, at the time, it was a very difficult sort of position to be in as part of the team of mediation advisors that they had, because we had to do scenario planning around what do we anticipate could happen. And the difficulty, David, is that we say, oh, you know, this failed and that failed, but the truth of the matter is we had plans. We could anticipate what would happen in Benghazi and in Libya afterwards. It's one thing to say we wanted to go in and protect those civilians, but by sending in NATO, you had to be very naive to think that this was not going to be about toppling Gaddafi. There was no way that
about toppling Gaddafi. But the argument. So my question, Sanam, is should
we have gone? I would have said back then. I would have said this is important. We're trying to do something right, and right now, unfortunately, my response is that given we keep making the same mistake. We are not interested in, we're not interested in state building. And I think this is something that we have to bear in mind. It's one thing talking about Bosnia and Kosovo in the 1990s. After 2001, after 9/11, we have been in a whole new world. And assuming that interest, first of all, Russia is back in the game, China is back in the game. Every single place that we say we're going to go into in the name of whatever it may be, we are creating the openings for all sorts of negative forces to come in, and those are negative forces that we've been able to create as a result of the Iraq War. So we can't compare where we are now politically and geopolitically with the 1990s. I won't disagree with you at all about Srebrenica and about Kosovo. They were in Europe. It's a very different story to the places we've been. And Kofi Annan was the head of peacekeeping. He did not heed any of the warnings from General Dallaire. He had repeated warnings. So
put that COVID. There were peacekeepers in Rwanda.
He wanted more.
He wanted peacekeepers in Rwanda, and they failed to do anything about.
Lindsey, they were pulled out. They were pulled out, and he wanted more of them, but he didn't get them.
Yeah, David, let me put this to you. Basically, your argument is, maybe is it based on the way things used to be? And basically, your argument, yes, you can argue when it comes to Srebrenica, you can argue when it comes to Kosovo, you can argue when it comes to Sierra Leone, but actually, now it's not just that it's not possible because of what you outlined about Russia and China and so on, but that these interventions, you know, arguably so many of them went wrong after that this argument is no longer valid.
Well, I mean, by and large, I think that the interventions that took place for humanitarian reasons and that were strictly targeted were pretty successful. I do think that Kosovo was a success. I mean, that's 2000. That's not some kind in the kind of dim, distant past, as was Sierra Leone in 2000. It hasn't solved all the problems for Sierra Leone, but it's certainly avoided.
The last 20 years, hasn't it?
Sorry, I missed the beginning of that.
It is 20 years ago, and the world has changed a lot in the last 20 years. Not because of these failed, not of those interventions, but because of Iraq. And don't you think it's arguable that Iraq was such a disaster, which led to such a catastrophe all over the Middle East, that has basically invalidated any possible intervention in the future? And you did support the invasion of Iraq, as I recall.
Yeah, no, I did, because you could see that the sanctions against Saddam Hussein were beginning to fail, and that what was going to happen was a recrudescence of what had happened before, and he had already embarked upon 2 major genocidal campaigns. And we could discuss for a very long time, and we should, about what happened subsequent to the invasion of Iraq. But if your contention is that that helped lead to a significant reluctance to take action in other states, I think that's entirely right. And that's led significantly to the idea of, if you like, kind of intervention light, which is drones plus local actors plus wash your hands of the entire business and hope that in the end the refugees pitch up in Turkey and Lebanon and not on the shores of Europe or the United States. That's essentially the position that we've.
Well, let me put that to Sanam. Let me put that point. So, because we are coming to this intervention, lack of intervention, and Iraq and Syria are the two sides of this coin. And so, with this lack of intervention in Syria, and I mean, you can talk about, dialogue and so on. I mean, frankly, that wasn't going anywhere right from the beginning, was it? And well, so you're essentially saying, so be it. Murders, atrocities.
No. So if you have to, again, you have to look at the details within all this stuff. And if we take Iraq and Syria, and David, we all know why we went into Afghanistan. But if you lived here in the US, you would have seen Laura Bush telling us that we were going in because we care about Afghan women. So there's always this shield of trying to prevent something, doing some good somewhere, which is used. Now, if you look at Syria and Iraq, the Iranians helped the Americans in tracking down the Taliban and securing Afghanistan in 2002. They offered to help with Iraq for good reason, because they couldn't stand Saddam. They'd had a huge war with them, right? That offer was refused at the time. So we have the Iraq war. The Iranians, of course, end up getting involved in that war because they're saying, well, somebody else's backyard is better than my own backyard. Fast forward to Syria. It was a moment where if the will had been there to actually think about it regionally, and again, I was at the UN when these discussions were happening, and my suggestion was, why don't we think about this in terms of reducing sanctions for Iran, bringing them into the table, see whether they can be part of the solution. They are going to be part of the problem. And the attitude was, oh, you're trying to make the problem bigger than it is. This notion that, oh, Syria is, it's a banana dictatorship and we're going to be able to go there and do something, get rid of Mr. Assad so simply, is a failure of our understanding of how these regimes work, of what's going on. And it's the problem of Western and American, and the British are slightly better, but the American attitude of these are caricature bad guys that we can't engage with. It doesn't work like that. The world doesn't work like that. I'm not suggesting that we let people die, but I also think that we have to be thinking more broadly around what the dynamics are of each case. And by the way, look at right now, let me just finish this. We have right now in India, we have Kashmiris have been under lockdown for 9 months. Muslims in India are being, their citizenship is being stripped for them. They're worried about ethnic cleansing. Where are we? We haven't said anything. Where is the condemnation for Mr. Johnson or Mr. Trump or the UN? And India is about to join the Security Council. So if we think about diplomacy, we're not really doing it effectively. And that's.
I don't think anybody here is going to be against diplomacy. I think that's.
So let's try it better than we did.
But David, let me bring you on to Syria, because I think that Sanam's points are very interesting, that there could have been a diplomatic intervention earlier on. And yet you, and I'm sure like myself, know many Syrians who feel very disappointed with the West and with the West's lack of involvement in any way. Do you think, David, that there should have been a Western intervention after the chemical weapons were used, for example?
Well, the trouble was, actually, I think it was too late even by then, because it's essentially what you'd have had to have done in 2013, I think, would have ended up in interdicting Assad's air force, and taking out the capacities that actually have been the significant part of what then led to the refugee flow, because it was a significant amount to do with how the Assad forces and the Russians then attacked those areas, which led to a significant movement of people. And I argued back in 2011, when it became clear that the Assad regime was determined to suppress any kind of democratic movement or movement for peaceful democracy and so on, and that he was going to suppress it, and that he was going to do that with the help of his Security Council vetoes on the part of China and Russia, and with the complete support of Iran. I'm not totally sure what you anticipated Sanam Iran would do under those circumstances. It's not at all clear to me, but I certainly thought at that stage we should create havens along the Turkish and Syrian borders and on for refugee, so that there could be, if you like, a kind of a non-Assad control of territory within which people could exist, and try and build it up from there. I have to say that wasn't a particularly popular option, and what we have now is we don't have interventionist leaders in America or Britain. Boris Johnson wanted Tony Blair impeached for what had happened in Iraq, and Donald Trump is a classic America firster. He's one of these people who back in 1940 would have said you shouldn't intervene in the Second World War. So what you have is a very different stamp, and in that sense you're both right, absolutely, that we have moved on significantly from that period. We have moved to a period of non-intervention by the West and a kind of hopelessness. And under those circumstances, it's rather pointless worrying about or declaiming what's happening in Kashmir, because we've already got to the situation whereby the West won't intervene in anything anywhere unless its interests are directly involved.
David, part of the reason for that is because of the failure of interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan. But I want to put a question to Sanam. So if you think about what the worst atrocity in the world is now, this is hard because there's so many contenders, but you've got 1 million Uyghurs in China who have been put in concentration camps. And I think that some of us would say, how can this be happening? You know, how can we be allowing what, you know, even worse than, you know, as bad as the Great Leap Forward and even worse than the Cultural Revolution? So what are both of you saying about this kind of atrocity? Sanam, are you saying, sorry about that, China's so powerful, absolutely nothing we can do about it, poor old Uyghurs, leave it there?
No, what I'm saying, and as I said before, it's devastating to see what's happening on our watch to the Uyghurs and to the Rohingya, and we just watched and we switched the channel and moved on. I think it's absolutely horrific. But I think that what we need to understand is that the West basically, and I do think you need to look at the world post 9/11, because it's a very different mentality coming from the West, from Tony Blair and the US. And you can look at it, Obama, it doesn't matter. It's in a post 9/11 world that we need to reboot, and we need to rethink where it is that where we're going to reassert moral authority. What we're missing right now is deep lack of moral leadership in the world. And the fact is, David, you said something about you know, the West doesn't intervene unless their interests are directly involved. We do intervene. This is I think we have sold weapons to Yemen. We have sold weapons to the Syrian militias and to the folks that give the Syrians the militias. We have lots of oil and other interests in Myanmar right now, and China. I mean, let's not pretend that we're not intervening. We have all sorts of ties with these countries, and we don't want to rock the boat. And so we have to rethink, what does diplomacy, what are we there? What is our position in the world? What are the values we want to stand up for? And this is something that it breaks my heart, because I don't think the Iranians, I'm Iranian by background, I don't think people in Iran are looking to China and to Russia for their future. They are not. They are the ideas that come, that, you know, when we think about democracy and so forth, that is fundamentally kind of lived by in the Western world, however flawed, this is where people look to. But we have been, the face of the West in these parts of the world has been military, and it has been force, and we have to rethink, what do we stand for, not constantly what are we against. And on the diplomacy, we're not doing enough. We're not putting enough resources into diplomacy.
I want David, can you respond to Sanam's point, and also to the point about the Uyghurs and China? I mean, now we're in this situation, this sort of post-intervention world. Is there any common ground that you have with Sanam then for redefining intervention, as it were?
It's quite interesting in a sense to have one's kind of period defined away out of existence. So, so automatically, when I invoke Tony Blair's Chicago speech of 1998, which I think does actually lay down some incredibly useful long-term guidelines for how the international community should think about these things. But obviously, one of the major problems that you have in dealing with any internal problem with China, as we know now, with looking at Hong Kong, is that you have a country which is so incredibly powerful and able to resist outside pressure. There's not the slightest chance that any form of, I mean, let's suppose that the worst actually came to the worst, that this actually did become a genocidal movement in China for one reason or another against the Uyghurs. Our capacity to realistically respond to it would in fact be incredibly limited. And in that case, it wouldn't matter what my view was or what your view was, Sanam, because none of our options for dealing with it would actually amount to very much. But there have been situations, and there still are situations around the world, where the responsibility to protect, me come back to that, one would, in the first circumstance, like it to be a United Nations responsibility, might demand that there was the capacity for a military intervention if there were no other possibilities at that stage. And to rule it out, as has happened over Syria, I think is a huge mistake. But it's also a mistake not to be realistic about where that policy goes, and not to be realistic about the other things that you should do, which involve also the involvement in diplomacy and in other kind of forms of building up of organizations and peoples and movements and so on, which can help create peaceful solutions. But not everybody is equally interested in peace.
Yeah, that is definitely true. Before I come on to the final wrapping up, let me ask you something else about that, David, because you made an interesting point in your initial presentation, where you said we shouldn't be talking about the West, we should be talking about the world. Now, in the period, up to 2000, we were talking about when Russia did either abstain or vote with certain interventions, and we're now in a very different position on the Security Council and so on, where Russia and China are very much against anything that the West can do. Do you see anything positive coming out of that more balanced world, as it were? Is there anything which you can see to handle that situation, which enables any kind of effective intervention, military or not, in preventing atrocities?
You could have argued up until fairly recently that there was a potential interest that the Chinese government would have in maintaining peace around the world and stability, and to a significant extent in avoiding those kind of greatest abuses of human rights, as it sought, if you like, to become one of the leading blocks in the international community. We are now heading abruptly in the other direction. The dangers are all going in the other direction at the moment, and we have, therefore, it's not so much a post 9/11 world. I'm not, 9/11 is one way station. There are other way stations. Maybe 2008 will prove to have been the other kind of great, the loss of collapse of confidence in the West, in its own systems and its own capacities, and post 2015 the growth of populist movements which reject intervention and which essentially have kind of ethno-nationalism as a significant kind of component, and then the coming of the new Cold War with China, and that puts you in a very different series of situations. So in a funny kind of a way, this may be the last knocking of a debate which we could only have again in a more optimistic world than the one we've got currently.
Let me take us right up to the world in which we are right now, and this is the final thing, the pandemic. Sadly, we're meeting each other online. I would love to be having a drink with you after this debate at the Imperial War Museum. That would be nice. We can't do that. But how do you think the pandemic affects the issue that we're talking about? Do you think we are heading into more conflict? Are we heading into civil unrest in countries where GDP has dropped? I've just been in Brazil. You know, GDP is expected to drop by between 6 and 9%, and the same is true in lots of other places. Let me come to you first, David, and then Sanam to round off. Are you concerned about that? And what do you think the West, the world, can do, if anything? Because we may see, you know, this kind of unrest coming up in a number of different places.
I'm terrified about it. I mean, I marked a number of way stations on the way. The sincere hope that President Trump is thrown out as American president in November, which could send a significant message to the rest of the world that the lesson that we were going to try to learn from the coronavirus pandemic was our interdependence and the need for international cooperation. The fact that these affect us, and use that effectively as the starting point for how we're going to look at any kind of reconstruction of the world order. And in that case, we could begin to address the incredible problems which we will have as a result of the post-pandemic era. That's on the optimistic side. We could go in that direction. We could decide to go in that direction, and we could not go in that direction, in which case I think, you know, we say the sky's the limit for good things. I'm not quite sure what the limit is for bad things, the center of the earth, whatever, but it could get even worse. So let's put our shoulder to that wheel.
Put our shoulder to that wheel. You have us down in the flames of hell with Dante and James Joyce.
So first, yeah.
What kind of global system intervention could there be, or none?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, David, I don't want to write away the 1990s. That was the period that inspired me to do all the work that I'm doing now, because I do think that things can be better. But I do think that we have to understand the era of the war on terror and how that mentality has enabled countries to use it as an excuse to go after their minorities, pretending that they're terrorists or whatever they are. So I think we have to understand that context. COVID, you know, it was a moment of opportunity. We had when Guterres called for the global ceasefire, it was serious for a while. And the country that blocked the Security Council resolution, for whatever it's worth, was the United States. And this is a really devastating, again, it's a very depressing moment to think that at that level, they couldn't even agree on the idea of a global ceasefire. So the Security Councils, that's their job, and they failed us over and over again. Where are we? I'm as depressed as you are, because what I see,
yeah, really clear of everybody watching.
Well, I'll end with a positive note. I see the unraveling of our international peace and security architecture. This idea that everybody can go off and do what they want. The Turks right now are going into Yemen. I mean, it's just become a free-for-all, which is kind of pre-League of Nations practically in some of its characteristics. But I also think that we need to this idea of reimagining what we're seeing right now on the ground. I talk to, and I'll be going on the next call with them. I talk to women in war zones every week in 40 countries every week. And you're welcome to join us if you'd like to hear what's going on. What is happening is at the very local level, people are doing what they can. And peace builders are a really important part of this, because these are people in their communities that are working with the government and the militias and reaching out and helping. They know what's going on. Extremism is on the rise. It's not just white supremacy here, it's the jihadists and others around the world. They filled the vacuums where the states have been absent. What it is showing us is that our economic models for the last 40 years, not just the last 20, but neoliberalism as a model of economic policy has failed. It's showing us that our security models, national security, where we put $800 billion in the Pentagon, but we don't have any masks for people, that's not fit for purpose right now. We need to shift and think about human security. So it's a moment for us to reimagine and make our institutions fit for purpose. But we have the laws, we have the courts, we've done so much, and it's so easy to destroy them and throw them aside instead of actually revisiting them and saying, how do we make, as I say, how do you apply what we've learned to address the conflicts of the future? Thank you.
We have to end it there. Thank you so much, Sanam Naraghi Anderlini and David Aaronovitch. A lot of food for thought there. I don't think we've exhausted the topic or all the topics which this leads into. So thank you very much to you and to the Imperial War Museum and Conciliation Resources for this latest in their online series, Reimagining Victory, to commemorate the 75th anniversary of VE Day. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.